Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 111. Today's show is going to be all about the scorpions and their near relatives. Now, of all the groups we're going to cover today, the scorpions are perhaps the most famous and well-known. They're the most charismatic. But every clade we're going to talk about today is really fascinating and wicked cool in their own way. So let's start with some evolutionary context, some evolutionary history. And then we'll take a closer look at their anatomy and physiology, their life cycle and behaviors, and their ecological role in the habitats they live in. In the previous episodes, I went to great lengths to explain the difficulty and complexity in organizing the arachnid family tree. A primary issue is that there just isn't much genetic data on these animals in the first place. The sun spiders or camel spiders, for example, have had almost no genetic sequencing done until very recently. Another issue we've run into is that different groups tend to evolve at different rates, and this can make comparisons a little complicated. The acariforms and parasitiforms, for example, evolve really quickly at a very fast rate, while the Apiliones and the scorpions evolve at a somewhat slower rate. Scientists have tried to compensate for this by comparing highly conserved, slow-changing genes, genes that are highly conserved across all of these groups. And by doing this, some arachnid phylogenies have been developed, but the placement of various groups still isn't well understood. There still isn't a lot of agreement about what the objective, final, accurate arachnid phylogeny should be. There's a mysterious haze lingering at the base of the family tree. It's hiding the primitive diversification of this particular set of arachnid groups, and the organization of this early branching of these major lineages, it's not clear. We're not quite sure who emerged first and second and third, who's related to who, which groups are sister to another, that kind of thing. Now in episode 109, I covered one of these lineages, which produced, in evolutionary order from oldest to youngest, the Apiliones harvestman spiders, the Ricynulae pseudospiders, and the Solifugae camel spiders. And of course, none of these are actually true spiders. In episode 110, I covered two more basal arachnid lineages, whose early evolution is still cryptic and unknown. The acariforms and parasitiforms, collectively known as the mites. And in today's episode, we're going to look at one last lineage that branched out from this primordial haze. Within this offshoot arachnid lineage, the first clade to diverge on their own, were the pseudoscorpions, primitive animals similar in many ways to the other basal clades I explored in the previous episodes, like the Solifugae and the parasitiforms. For example, the pseudoscorpions are apulmonate arachnids, meaning they don't have book lungs. They have more traditional trachea and spiracles. If we're still looking at this offshoot arachnid lineage, but we're going to ignore for the moment the pseudoscorpions who branched off to form their own clade and they're doing their own thing, the remaining lineage, the remaining stem group here, there was ancestral populations that evolved book lungs. I'll get into more detail on this in a bit, but this is just a more centralized, larger respiratory structure analogous to the heart for the cardiovascular system. But it was evolved in these small arthropods, these arachnids, as a way to help them breathe a bit more efficiently, and it also led to some of them growing quite large. So this stem group that evolved book lungs would eventually produce the true scorpions of the order Scorpiones, and a superorder called Tetrapulmonata, which are characterized by having one or two pairs of book lungs. Furthermore, the Tetrapulmonata would diverge to produce the Araneae, which is the very rich and very diverse clade of true spiders. And closely related to them was the Pedipalpi, which includes two closely related orders of whip scorpions, the Amblypygae and the Europygae. Okay, so that was a lot of taxonomic names that I just kind of threw at you all at once there. So to summarize this and simplify it, in essence, we have the final arachnid lineage, which first produced the pseudoscorpions, the last of the major apulmonate clades, and then the stem group evolved book lungs. Although it's debated whether this evolution of book lungs happened once in the common ancestor of the group, or if it happened multiple times from within independent lineages within the group. In today's episode, we'll look at all of these groups except for the true spiders. That massively diverse division of the family tree will get its own episode. But for now, we're going to talk about the true scorpions and their relatives. As is tradition, let's start way back in evolutionary history, at the base of this family tree, with the divergence of the most primitive groups. In this case, the earliest branch would be the pseudoscorpions, which emerged in the mid to late Devonian, approximately 380 million years ago. But if I'm going to tell you the story of the evolutionary history of arachnids, we're not going to start here. We're going to go even farther back in time, a lot farther, to about 510 to 508 million years ago, so we're about 500 million years back in time. This is when the first chelicerates emerged. Remember from episode 109 that the chelicerates are named after the presence of chelicera, modified leg-like appendages protruding from the face that are analogous to mandibles. They help with feeding and handling food. A similar pair of appendages was also evolved in this group, called the pedipalps. These appendages evolved different forms to serve various purposes across the chelicerate clade. Most chelicerate species, with some notable exceptions, have retained relatively typical pedipalps, mostly used as opposable sense organs or genital structures. Camel spiders have large pedipalps, and they're pretty fearsome looking, and you might think that they're used for predation, to hunt and capture and rip apart prey. But in actuality, these are used for sensory purposes, to feel out the ground ahead of them. Across almost 200 million years of evolutionary change, emerging lineages began to specialize their pedipalps as claws or pincers to grab prey, manipulate its body, and present its flesh to the mouth for consumption. This was perhaps first seen in the Opiliones harvestman spiders. Many other species evolved these pincer-bearing appendages, but adapted them to Herculean sizes relative to their body and the rest of their legs. These would become the many different types of scorpions. Of all of these emerging proto-scorpion lineages, the oldest surviving lineage, at least 383 million years old, is the pseudoscorpions, which today contains more than 3,300 species of small, flat, oval-shaped arachnids that are more or less unchanged from their primordial ancestors. They have relatively short legs, but long, arm-like pedipalps coming out of their face that gives their bodies a front-heavy appearance. At the end of the pedipalps, they have glossy, bulbous pincers that are very similar to those of the true scorpions. If it isn't obvious, this trait, these big pincers at the end of the pedipalps, is precisely why they're named pseudoscorpions. The pseudoscorpion pincer contains one claw affixed to the hand, and a second claw that's mobile, kind of like a thumb, and it can be used to pinch down on prey. In a majority of pseudoscorpions, both or just one of these claws, in this case it would usually be the mobile articulating claw or the thumb, it contains a venom gland. The pseudoscorpion venom is a rich mixture of various protease inhibitors, peptidase inhibitors, metallopeptidases, and phosphodisruptors, and a couple small molecule toxins unique to pseudoscorpions. This venom can be injected into captured prey, paralyzing it and rendering it defenseless against the pseudoscorpion's eating process. First, they'll bring the food close and hold it under their mouth, and then they'll drool out an acidic juice that partially melts and softens the paralyzed prey. Then they'll dig into this softened tissue and rip it apart with claws and chelicera, and eat it up piece by piece. Much like some other basal arachnid groups, like the spider mites for example, the pseudoscorpions have silk glands. These are mounted in the front of the head, and it's not used to spin webs, but rather this silk gland is used to spin cocoons that the pseudoscorpions use to safely overwinter, or as a protected place to molt. When they're not wrapped up in the silken blankets of their cocoon, the pseudoscorpions are active predators that hunt through the soil and the leaf litter or the branches and leaves of the bushes and tree canopy. They search for smaller arthropods like ants, lice, and various larvae to eat, often some kind of tiny pest or parasite. This is a really curious aspect of pseudoscorpion ecology. Because they're relatively small, they can cling to the body of a larger organism, such as a bigger insect like a wasp or a beetle. They don't parasitize this larger organism, but instead they hitchhike. They use the host as a vehicle for transport. In this arrangement, by clinging to the belly of a bee or under the wing plate of a beetle or something, the pseudoscorpion can pick parasites out of the host's carapace and eat them kind of like protein-rich popcorn or candy. In this way, they engage in a kind of symbiosis, using the host creature as a vehicle for transport and a mobile buffet of mites, nematodes, and other microscopic parasites. And in return, eating the parasites is beneficial for the host, as it slows or stops parasite-induced tissue damage, and it lowers the immediate risk of infection from parasite-vectored diseases. The pseudoscorpions also contribute to the ecology by being occasional food for many carnivores, from arthropods to small lizards, birds, and mammals. It's worth noting that the placement of the pseudoscorpions within this offshoot arachnid lineage in relation to the true scorpions and true spiders and others, the placement of the pseudoscorpions is not known for certain. They appear to be closely related to the true scorpions. Maybe they could even be an ancient sister lineage. Although, whatever their relationship is, whether they're a sister lineage or not, and if they're not, which one appeared first, and thus the precise nature of the pseudoscorpion relationship to the true scorpions, is unknown. This is still cryptic. It hasn't been figured out yet. Genetic analysis has been slow to make progress on this front. The true scorpions emerged some 435 million years ago, which is a fair bit older than the oldest 383 million year old pseudoscorpion fossils that we've found to date. Now, this could suggest that the scorpions are older, and the pseudoscorpions are an ancient daughter clade that split off from true scorpions hundreds of millions of years ago. But there's conflicting genetic and physiological evidence, such as the use of trachea to breathe, that suggests that the pseudoscorpions are indeed the more basal clade. In any case, the scorpions are an amazing group that includes over 2,500 species, with many fascinating features and unique attributes. Naturally, there's much diversity across the behavior and ecology of the scorpions, but it's safe to say that most of them are active in low light or nighttime conditions. They're generally a nocturnal arthropod. During the day, they'll typically take shelter where it's cool and shady. Many species dig their own burrows, like the scorpions of the Hadrurus genus, which are known for their extensive digging, foraging, and burrowing behaviors. Other species will exploit environmental features like cracks in the sand or stone, decaying logs or thick bark, leaf litter, or even the dens and burrows of other animals. The scorpion's head and torso form a fused segment called a cephalothorax, as it is with most arachnids. This cephalothorax contains both the face and most of the major limbs. On top of the head, the scorpions have 2 primary eyes, and another 2 to 5 pairs of eyes running along the front of the face. But despite having a lot of eyeballs, the scorpions have relatively poor vision, and they can't resolve clear images. But they are sensitive to light, which is an asset in low light conditions, and allows some species to use starlight to perform nocturnal navigation. The Chelicera mouthparts are like miniature pincers with serrated claws. They're used to capture and pin down prey, to hold them steady, and when they're paralyzed and subdued, the pincers pull small bits of meat off the prey so the scorpion can feed. The chelicera will bring the food in front of, or rather below the mouth, and the scorpion will vomit up some caustic digestive acids onto it. The chelicera will then handle the food and roll it around as it melts into a mushy paste, and then further breaks down into a liquid, which is then sucked through a mustache-like filter of stiff hairs before finally getting to the mouth for ingestion. These stiff hairs in front of the mouth that act kind of like a filter-feeding mustache, these filter out any materials that haven't been fully liquefied by the digestive acids, like claws or bits of exoskeleton, as these things are demonstrably indigestible. The chelicera will wipe off the debris, and then pinch, pull, and slice off more flesh to eat. But the chelicera are dwarfed by the relatively large pedipalps that have been adapted into armored and heavily muscled pincers that can grab and disassemble prey, or pinch, envenom, and scare off predators. Now, most scorpions are generalists, so they'll eat whatever manageable bee, termite, grasshopper, beetle, mite, or spider comes near the entrance of their burrow. Some scorpions are active hunters who will actually leave the burrow to actively find food, pursue prey. Larger scorpions, or those that are particularly brave, will even prey on rodents and little lizards and tiny birds, and other vertebrates small enough to be captured and pinned by the pincer claws. But of course, going after this kind of prey, after these small vertebrates, can be really risky for the arthropod. All of these creatures have claws or teeth capable of scratching, dismembering, maiming, killing these scorpions. So when they go after them and try and hunt these things down, it's all the more impressive. As scorpions can be found in a wide diversity of habitats across the world, the creatures that prey upon them are also quite diverse. Larger arthropods, like big spiders and centipedes, can hunt and prey upon scorpions. Vertebrate predators include lizards and snakes, frogs and salamanders, a wide variety of birds, and many omnivorous and insectivorous mammals like rodents and bats. To deter these predators, the scorpion will raise its claws, move its tail threateningly, and in some species, they can even spit out a small stream of venom that can burn the eyes and the soft mucous membranes of the nose and ears. In addition to being powerful tools for capturing prey and warding off predators, the pedipalps also contain sensory organs and relay both tactile and chemical sensory data to the scorpion's brain, which is embedded deep in the rear of the cephalothorax. Similarly, the scorpion's 8 legs are not just used for locomotion, but, much like the pedipalps, they also serve a sensory function. Most scorpions have some kind of structures mounted on their legs, like hairs or bristles, that can detect changes in wind or air pressure, as well as physical contact with objects. Connected to and immediately behind the cephalothorax is the mesosoma, or the pre-abdomen, which contains the bulk of the scorpion's organs. The true scorpions are basal pulmonates, meaning they're one of the older lineages of arachnids with internalized book lungs. The scorpions have 8 of these book lungs, arranged in 4 pairs within the mesosoma. Each book lung has an outer corridor leading to a spiracle, a pore on the outer surface of the animal that allows air to come in and circulate and waste gases to be expelled. These spiracles are typically arranged linearly down either side of the scorpion's abdomen. Also projecting from the book lungs are inner corridors or trachea leading to the heart, where hemolymph can be reoxygenated. The gonads are also embedded here, and lead to a genital pore on the underside of the animal. Scorpions generally reproduce using a complicated but really cool mating ritual. It begins with the female scorpion. When she's sexually receptive, when she's ready to find a mate, she'll secrete pheromones that can be detected by nearby males. With their curiosity aroused, they'll wander over and dig around until they find her. They'll demonstrate they're interested by keeping their feet in place, but sliding their bodies side to side in a strange dance-like display called juddering. If the female is receptive, if the male puts on an impressive juddering display and she likes it, then the male will approach her and they'll begin to touch their pedipalps together, sometimes even locking their pincers together, like they're holding hands. In this stance, facing each other, they'll wander around, going in circles, back and forth, in zigzags and so on, and sometimes kissing with their chelicera, whatever the scorpion analog of kissing would be. One of the purposes of this complex and strangely beautiful mating dance is to allow the male to explore the environment and find a suitably hard surface upon which he can deposit a spermatophore. This is a glob of mucus, structural compounds, and various proteins, and sperm that the male will place on the ground and then guide the female over during their dance, such that he can line up the spermatophore with her genital pore. Once they get lined up, the male will help lower the female over the spermatophore so that it enters the genital pore and brings sperm to the gonad. This leads to fertilization and the formation of a mucus plug that prevents future mating events until the current batch of offspring are gestated and born. And really interestingly, mini scorpion offspring are born live. Among virtually all the arachnids, only the scorpions are viviparous, giving birth to live young. And stranger still, among arthropods generally, mother scorpions are very devoted and protective parents. Entire broods of larvae are often carried on the mother's back, even undergoing their first collective molting event together on the armor plates of her abdomen's back. As the offspring mature, they'll get braver and more individualistic. They'll try to seek out on their own, they'll go explore on their own before returning to their mother. And eventually, they'll become able to hunt on their own. So when they seek out to explore and find food, eventually, they won't return to their mother. They're big enough and strong enough to go out into the world on their own. One has to wonder how the scorpion mother feels about this. Do scorpion mothers get empty nest syndrome? It's an interesting question. Okay, where were we? Before we got onto scorpion reproduction, we were talking about the organs in the mesosoma, the pre-abdomen, including the book lungs, the heart, and the gonads. Well, we're not done with that just yet. In addition to these organs, there's also several digestive organs that are packed away within the abdomen, with the intestinal tract tunneling so far up the tail that the anal pore presents on the underside of the final tail segment, right before the stinger. You might have assumed that the scorpion tail was kind of like the tail of a vertebrate, where it's an extension of the vertebral column going past like the pelvis, and the anus is mounted somewhere there in the pelvis. It's not on the tail. But that's not the case in the scorpions. In the scorpions, the intestinal tract goes through the tail, and the anus is near the tip of the tail. So, in a sense, the entire body continues past the legs, but not like a tail, more like a super long, curling pelvis or something. On the topic of excreting waste, curiously, the scorpions do not urinate, but instead they remove nitrogenous waste by excreting solid masses of guanine and uric acid and various other waste compounds. For this reason, because they practice a kind of dry urination, they preserve their body's water really well, and they can endure drought and desiccating conditions much better than most other arthropods. This is, of course, one of the reasons why scorpions have a predominant reputation as iconic desert creatures. Among all of the arthropods, the scorpions are among the hardiest and the best able to survive in the desert. In an environment that's relatively empty and low complexity, any living creature tends to stand out and get noticed. Something as charismatic as a scorpion is definitely going to become iconic of the brutal, sun-scorched habitat. Now, the scorpion's tail, or its metastoma, is perhaps the most interesting appendage on its body, And that's really saying something, because they have weird legs and the pedipalps are really cool. But indeed, it is the case that the scorpion tail is its most characteristic and recognizable feature. 5 tube-like body segments form the tail, which typically curls out to the side or up over the back of the scorpion, the hefty stinger held menacingly overhead, waiting to strike a foe who comes too close for comfort, or a prey animal who puts up a bit too much resistance. The stinger itself is a thin, needle-like projection, hardened with metalloproteins loaded with zinc. The base of the stinger expands into a bulbous organ at the tip of the tail called a telson, which contains a pair of venom glands. Twin ducts descend from the glands to the tip of the stinger, presenting a dual-stream venom injection mechanism. The venom itself is a stew of salts and various polypeptides, like chlorotoxin, which interferes with ion channels and nervous tissue. Studies have identified many dozens, even hundreds of different toxic chemicals in scorpion venom. Make no mistake, the venom isn't one single substance. It's an extremely diverse soup of chemicals that, upon injection, has an extraordinary collection of effects on the target organism, from shutting down its nervous system and causing muscular paralysis, to coagulating blood and impeding vascular function, to chemically neutralizing or disrupting the immune system and preventing an immune response. Coincidentally, the largest family of scorpions, the Buthidae, which includes about half of all known scorpion species, also contains the scorpions with the most deadly venoms. In fact, of the 20 species of scorpion whose venom poses a medically significant, potentially lethal threat to humans, 19 of them, 19 of 20, are in the Buthidae family. These include the fat-tailed Androctonus man-killer scorpions, the deathstalker scorpion Leiurus quinquestriatus, the physically enormous species in the Parabuthus genus, the colorful and deadly Indian red scorpion Hotentota temulus, and the aggressive, sting-happy Brazilian yellow scorpion Titius seriolatus. In a very interesting evolutionary development, these strong venoms have led the Buthidae scorpions to over-rely on their tails for offensive functions, and reserve their pedipalp pincers for fine motor activities like food handling. As a result of this evolutionary dynamic, the tails have adapted to become thick and muscular, while the chelicera and the pedipalps tend to be thin, with pincers that are more like tweezers or tapering little fingers, rather than heavy, bulbous, muscle-knuckled claws that you see in so many other species. This is a really interesting evolutionary trade-off. The scorpion either prioritizes its pincers for offensive actions, for grabbing, holding, and ripping apart prey, or it prioritizes its venomous tail attacks for capturing prey and deterring predators. When a scorpion species uses the strategy with one body part, like its arms, it's necessarily using its other body part, like its tail, a little bit less. And so that body part might atrophy, it might be reduced or retooled for some other purpose. Why can't the scorpion just grow a big, strong, venomous tail and big, strong claws? Why doesn't it just get the best of both worlds? Well, that's the fitness trade-off. The scorpion has a limited amount of nutrients that it can invest to grow its body, and muscle tissue is metabolically expensive. Venom is extremely expensive to produce. It's just not feasible for a scorpion to be able to optimize both weapon systems, the claws and the venomous tail, because it's just too expensive. It requires too many calories and too many nutrients. So each scorpion lineage generally adapts to specialize either one weapon system or the other. One particularly cool fact about scorpions is that their exoskeleton contains compounds like the tryptophan derivative beta-carboline, which is fluorescent under UV light. These chemicals are the byproduct of the sclerotization process, a chemical hardening of the exoskeleton that takes place after every molt. As the scorpion ages and repeatedly molts, it builds up these beta-carboline compounds in the outer cuticle, particularly at the harder points like along the pincers and the ridges of the body segments. Young scorpion larvae are not fluorescent, but as they molt over and over again, the cuticle will build up beta-carboline compounds, and it becomes more and more fluorescent under UV light. It's not really understood why scorpions have this fluorescent trait. It's hypothesized to be some kind of visual aid to provide light for the scorpion to see by, or perhaps the scorpions can visually detect the fluorescence as a kind of species identifier, or perhaps as a way to find mates. These visual sensory explanations for why scorpions fluoresce under UV light are interesting and, I suppose, plausible, but they're still pretty speculative, because the most obvious question is, these are organisms that don't have very good vision, so what use would visual cues be in critical behavior, like trying to find a mate or something like that? Okay, so let's pause for a second to regroup and review some of the material we've covered so far. The early days of the arachnid class are poorly understood. Lots of different branches of the lineage emerged here, but we don't know exactly when or in what ways the modern lineages are related to each other. One basal lineage produced the Apillionese harvestmen, the Rhysnulae pseudospiders, and the Soliphigi camel spiders. Two more basal lineages were the Acariforms and the Parasitiforms, or the mites and the ticks. One more basal lineage emerged and diversified drastically, producing the pseudoscorpions and the true scorpions, which we just covered. After the pseudo and the true scorpions emerged, the remaining lineage, or the stem group, would undergo one more major divergence. This produced the common ancestor of two groups, the superorder Pedipalpi, which we'll explore in this episode, and all of the true spiders of the order Araneae, which we'll explore in the next couple of episodes. You're probably familiar with spiders of the order Araneae, but I bet you're less familiar with their closest cousins, the creatures in the superorder Pedipalpi, collectively referred to as whip scorpions and whip spiders, although, to clarify again, they're neither true scorpions nor true spiders. They're just closely related to them. Try to imagine a zoological gradient filled with evolutionary intermediary creatures, whose member species possess various features from both their older, more basal scorpion relatives and the younger, more derived spider relatives. Those intermediary creatures that you're imagining probably look very similar to the very real arachnids in the orders Europygi and Amblypygi. All members of the Pedipalpi, including all species in both Europygi and Amblypygi orders, have a characteristically flattened morphology, where the spiders tend to be globular or pear-shaped, and the scorpions tend to be more elongated and cylindrical. The Pedipalpi have bodies that are shaped more like smartphones or coins, with broad, flat body segments. With this in mind, there are still noticeable differences between the groups. The Europygi tend to be more scorpion-like in shape and appearance, with an elongated, semi-cylindrical abdomen and large pincers, while the Amblypygi tend to be more spider-like, with more compact bodies and a shorter abdomen. In the case of the Amblypygi, their name literally means blunt tail, representing their lack of pointy appendage at the distal tip of the abdomen. The flat body shape allows them to crawl into small openings, cracks, and crevices, and this helps them hunt by ambush, it helps them avoid predators, and it helps them stay out of the light and the heat of the midday sun. Like the scorpions, most species have large pedipalps with pincers or claws at the end. Like spiders, they all have a pedicel, a small, narrow bridge of flesh connecting the cephalothorax to the abdomen. Another curious trait found in all pedipalpi is the modified first walking legs. As arachnids, All mature Europygi and Amblypygi have 4 pairs of legs. However, these groups have evolved their first pair of legs to be long, whip-like antennae, which is the titular feature of the common names for the clades, the whip scorpions and the whip spiders, respectively. These whip-like forelegs are typically long and slender, often several times the animal's body length. They're too structurally weak to be used for walking. They can't support the animal's body weight, but they are covered in sensitive hairs and various chemoreceptors that make them powerful sensory organs. These whip-like legs, which you could argue are in the process of evolving into modified antennae, will sweep the ground and the air around the animal, seeking the odor of food or potential mates, or the vibrations in the ground that would indicate territorial invaders, or nearby predators, or scrambling prey. The pedipalpi rely on these 4-leg pseudoantennas because their eyesight is poor. Europygi and Amblypygi generally have a main pair of eyes in the front or on the top of their head, and a trio of eyes clustered on each side. But just like the scorpions, despite this large number of eyes, their vision remains pretty bad. They're light sensitive, they can tell light from dark, and they can tell when things move in front of a light source, but they can't form clear images. Every species of Europygi and Amblypygi are carnivorous. Most of them are opportunists and generalists who eat a wide variety of arthropods, including millipedes and earthworms, termites and cockroaches, springtails and isopods, lice and mites, even other scorpions and spiders, and even other members of the pedipalpi superorder. Some of the larger species, like the 3.5-inch-long, burly, lobster-clawed members of the Europygi genus Mastigoproctus, are capable of hunting and killing tiny vertebrates, like little lizards and small frogs. Let's start with the Amblypygi, the whip spiders. The oldest fossils suggest they emerged about 310 to 315 million years ago. And after all that time, after all the diversification that was possible and that actually happened in their evolutionary history, the modern Amblypygi now includes more than 150 living species, spread across 5 families. All of these species are nocturnal hunters. They can be found in caves, in crevices, under tree bark, and buried in the soil and the leaf litter in tropical and subtropical habitats across the world. The Amblypygi tend to hunt by scaling a vertical surface, like the side of a tree or a large rock, and while looking down, they'll drape their antennae, their long legs, down to the ground below. When a suitably small and tasty creature is detected, perhaps it moves by on the ground and brushes against these dangling antenna-like forelegs, the whip spiders will lash out with their pedipalps and ensnare the prey with their knobbly claws. Their pedipalp arms are unusually long and almost mantis-like in appearance and function. The elbows contain beds of thorns and spikes that can assist in capturing and mechanically tearing up food. This predation strategy of using a drop-down surprise attack has several neat advantages. First of all, as it's quietly hanging onto a vertical surface, it's not moving that much. It can blend into the rock or the tree. It's not rustling around on the forest floor, making noise and exposing itself, so it's harder for both predators and prey to see it. Second, the drop-down surprise approach optimizes the speed and success rate of the Amblypygi's attack. They want to spend as little time as possible exposing themselves and handling their prey before returning to the shadows to eat. They want to be stealthy and fast because they don't have venom. None of the Amblypygi species are venomous. They lack entirely this chemical means of paralyzing or killing prey and warding off predators. Having evolved without any venom to defend themselves, they tend to be skittish and wary. They have to be quiet, and they have to be quick. Otherwise, they'll become lunch for some larger creature that they can't defend themselves against. When it comes to reproduction, the amblypygi share many similarities with true scorpions. The male and the female hold each other by the pedipalps, and they do a dance, where the male guides the female over his spermatophore. Only the amblypygi spermatophores also include a stalk. The spermatophore, this glob of sperm and protein, is raised off the ground a bit to help the long-legged amblypygi couple achieve proper placement of the spermatophore, proper insertion of the sperm, and, later, higher success rates of fertilization. When the eggs are produced, they're laid in a kangaroo-like pouch under the female's abdomen. When the eggs hatch, the offspring are, much like a scorpion, carried on the mother's back. The offspring will be fed and protected by the mother, even engaging in a collective first molting event with their siblings, until eventually they mature and go live off on their own. When the amblypygi become adults, they continue to molt, but this process has to be gravity-assisted. The amblypygi will find a leaf or a branch or some suitable overhang, and they'll suspend themselves such that gravity will help pull the heavy, wet body out of the drier, lighter, and much too tight old exoskeleton. Okay, now let's shift over to look at the Europygi, the whip scorpions, which is the sister clade to the amblypygi. The Europygi is significantly more species-rich, with twice as many species, over 330 species, although these all belong to just a single extant family, Thelaphonidae. You could make the argument that despite them being more species-rich, they might, as a whole, be less biodiverse, because instead of having multiple families, this large number of species are all included in just one family. They all seem to be a little bit more closely related than the amblypygi groups that are split up into different families and represent perhaps a bit more genetic diversity. Now, your typical Europygian arachnid, your average whip scorpion, is between 1 and 3.3 inches long, not including the long, thin, whip-like tail they possess spiking up out of the tip of the abdomen. The tail, despite having a syringe-like appearance, is not a venomous weapon, as it is in scorpions. In fact, just like the amblypygi, the Europygi are entirely non-venomous. However, this doesn't mean they are completely without chemical defenses, like the hapless amblypygi. The Europygi are often called vinegar scorpions, or vinegaroons, because they can produce and spray out of their abdomen a caustic, burning substance that smells like vinegar. This substance is a combination of acetic and caprylic acids, which can burn sensitive tissues like eyes and mucous membranes. It's not going to kill the target, but it's still quite helpful. Smaller prey animals can be stunned and disoriented by the acid, making them easy meals. Larger predatory animals can be surprised or discouraged by the acid attack, choosing to avoid the Europygi entirely instead of eating it. If the acid doesn't do the trick, though, their massive curling pedipalps are equipped with spines and giant lobster-like pincers that can crush, shred, and destroy small prey animals. Larger predators can be warned off with a thorny pinch that has a pretty good chance of puncturing their skin or their scales. In terms of mating and reproduction, the Europygi really aren't all that dissimilar from the amblypygi and the true scorpions. They hold pincers, they do the mating dance, they guide the female over the spermatophore. A small difference is that the Europygi males appear to help the females a bit more often, sometimes handing the spermatophore over to her, or even helping push it into the female's genital pore with his pedipalps. During the mating ritual, when their pincers are locked together in a loving embrace and they're dancing under the light of the moon and the stars, the males have also been seen to use their chelicera mouthparts to gently fondle the tips of the female's sensitive antenna legs. It's not known for certain if this is some kind of erotic massage-type behavior as part of the courtship dance, or if it serves a more mundane maintenance function, like helping clean the female's antenna so she's better able to protect herself and the young offspring. A few weeks later, after the eggs have matured a bit inside the female, she'll begin to dig a burrow, and then she'll close herself up inside of it, walling off the entrance to create a sealed nest environment. The female will then lay a brood sac filled with 2 to 3 dozen eggs, give or take. The brood sac comes out of the female but remains attached to her, and for the next few weeks or months, the female will sit there in this dark hole of a nest and hold the attached brood sac up off the ground. She won't hunt, she won't eat. She'll just bunker down in this sealed-off cavity and hold up the brood sac until the young mature and hatch out of their eggs and then chew their way out of the brood sac. At this point, the reproductive cycle begins to look more like that of a traditional scorpion. The young newborns attach themselves to the mother's back, where they're fed and protected until shortly after the first collective molting, whereupon they leave their mother and fend for themselves. Okay, now before we wrap up, there's one more little clade I want to mention. We just covered the Amblypygi and the Europygi. These are sister lineages, and together their collective lineage is sister to the true spiders of the order Araneae. Well, it turns out there's another little clade, a little offshoot branch sticking out near this division between the Amblypygi and the Europygi, estimated to have diverged about 310 million years ago in the steamy late Carboniferous jungles of tropical Pangaea. This clade is called the Schizomyda, and it contains more than 230 species of small ant-like whip scorpions. Now, depending on which taxonomist you're talking to, the Schizomyda may be sister to the Europygi lineage, or it may be part of it, as a really basal Europygi offshoot. However you want to classify them, they remain quite similar to the Amblypygi and the Europygi in many ways. They have a short whip-like tail and thick pedipalps with large pincers, just like the rest of the Europygi. And like all pedipalpi, they use their hind 6 legs for walking, as the foremost pair of legs has been adapted into pseudo-antennae. Interestingly, the hindmost pair of legs have evolved to be larger and stronger to allow the Schizomyda to make sudden leaps, to jump out of the way of danger, kind of like a grasshopper. This is another strategy for avoiding predators, if you can't rely on powerful venoms to paralyze or injure any potential attackers. Despite all of these similarities, there's also some unique differences among the Schizomyda. Unlike most pulmonate arachnids, which have multiple pairs of book lungs, the Schizomyda have but a single pair. They've also evolved to lose their eyes, with only a handful of species retaining light-sensitive clusters of cells that can barely tell the difference between light and dark. In addition, their exoskeleton isn't very tough. It's soft and flexible, which may help them maneuver through really tight spaces, but it also puts them at increased risk of desiccation. As a result, the Schizomyda are limited to moist habitats in humid areas, typically the leaf litter and soggy soil of a rainforest. However, some species live a more arboreal lifestyle, scuttling across leaves and branches in the tree canopy, where they prey on small microherbivores like mites and aphids. Yet other species live inside the nests of some other bug, like an ant colony or a termite mound. And a very small number of species, probably enough to count on one hand, live under rocks and in the soil in colder habitats that experience regular snowfall. As the Schizomyda are pretty small creatures, at most a fifth the size of the smallest Europygian whip scorpion, you would think that they'd be limited to small prey, like aphids and nematodes. On the contrary, the Schizomyda are remarkably, surprisingly vicious and active predators, capable of taking down prey animals as big as they are, which is actually pretty uncommon for animals this size. Lice, mites, zoropterans, and isopods are all small, easy-to-handle prey, but the Schizomyda can also capture millipedes, cockroaches, and small beetles. To do this, the schizomyta will constantly scan the environment with its antenna legs, seeking out suitable prey animals. Upon finding an animal, the antenna will lightly brush all over it, in a very careful exercise that rarely disturbs the animal, but gives the schizomyta a tremendous amount of tactile and chemosensory information about its target. If the target is deemed vulnerable, then the schizomyta makes a sudden surprise attack, lunging forward, seizing the prey animal in its powerful, curling pedipalps. The prey animal may fight back, but it's usually too stunned or damaged by the initial collision with the pedipalps to resist. If it does manage to fight back, the schizomyta can crush down harder with its pedipalp claws, or provide some extra traction and leverage with its legs, especially its powerful hind legs. Once the prey animal has been neutralized, the schizomyta will retreat to the safety of a cave, a crevice, or a burrow, and begin to eat its meal. The prey animal is disassembled into chunks. Each chunk is held up below the chelicera, softened into a mushy liquid with regurgitated digestive acids, and then slurped up into the mouth. Alright everyone, I think this is a pretty good place to stop for today. This has been a super cool and very exciting episode on the scorpions and their relatives. A recurring theme that I'm sure you've noticed now is the general lack of information on these animals. Like the acariforms and parasitiforms of last episode, many scorpion relatives are understudied, and as a result, they're poorly understood. The most obvious example of this is the fact that we just don't understand the phylogenetics of the early arachnids, so we don't really understand the specifics of how any of these basal clades are related to each other. We don't know if the pseudoscorpions descended from true scorpions, if they're sister lineages, or some other arrangement, and as another example, the schizomyta are extremely poorly understood. Almost every fact about them that I briefly cited here in this episode came from a single book published in 2009 called Arachnids by Jan Beccaloni, a curator of arachnids and myriapods at the Natural History Museum in London. It seems to be the case that all of the information that mankind has ever generated on the schizomyta can essentially fit into a section of a chapter of a single book. So I suppose if there's a final parting message that I want to leave with you, it's that if you're looking for a path in the natural sciences where you can readily discover new things and contribute to humanity's knowledge of the natural world, try this. Study the scorpions, the whip spiders, and the schizomyta. Study their genetics and their biochemistry. Study their behaviors and ecology. I guarantee that you'll discover something no one has seen before. If you're interested in science and you are wondering what field to pursue, maybe take that into consideration. Anyway, if you enjoyed this utterly badass episode, then hit the like button or leave a 5-star review. Subscribe to the channel for more supremely badass content, and hit that bell so you get notifications when I post something new. If you want to support the show financially, then check out the official store, or consider becoming a Patreon supporter. Links to these resources are in the description section. And as always, thank you so much for listening.